Good evening. My name is Barry Logan. I'm the current president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webcast. This is one in a series of webinars we've featured over the last 2 months on career opportunities and guidance for people who are either entering or thinking about entering the forensic sciences. American Academy of Forensic Sciences is the largest forensic organization in the United States for professionals practicing in the field. We have over 7,000 members in 11 different disciplines, including toxicology, pathology, biology, criminalistics, digital evidence, question documents, and so on, and including physical anthropology. And this evening we have two of our members, Dr. Chelsey Juarez and Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield from the Physical Anthropology section, who are going to talk to you about the field of forensic anthropology and how to get involved in that field. And if you're already entered in the field, some of the things you can do to help advance and promote your career and your career track. The general format for the webinar is that our guest presenters will talk for about 20 minutes or so. You can see on your screen there's an opportunity through the chat box to ask questions if you have questions. Typically we reserve those until the end of the formal presentation, and then the presenters will address the questions generally in the order that they came in. If you are, if there are things in the webinar that you don't manage to take notes on, or you don't get to see all of it, the entire broadcast or webinar will be archived on the web in a couple of days, and you can go back and review that again at your leisure. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand you over to two of the members from our Physical Anthropology section.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Dr. Chelsey Juarez, and I'm going to go through the presentation. Phoebe, please feel free to interject at any time and further explain anything. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about what forensic anthropology is. We're going to see some of the things that forensic anthropologists do. And then we're going to talk about some logistical things like educational requirements, salary expectations. And then at the very end of the talk, I'm going to give you a checklist, and it comes from a handout that I give to all of my students, my undergraduate students and my early master students that are interested in pursuing forensic anthropology as a professional career. So I just wanted to mention to you that in addition to the talk that will be posted, there will also be a handout that details some of the steps that we're going to talk about at the end. Okay? So I'm going to advance the talk here. All right, so the forensic anthropologists, as previously mentioned, are part of the physical anthropology section of the AAFS. There are 11 sections, and we have about 577 members. There are some people that attend our meetings that are students, and we encourage that. In fact, we have several things for students that are very specific to students, like the Young Forensic Scientist Forum, where you can go and meet people who are active in the field, who are publishing in the field, and they can give you some tips about your career. And all that information is present on the AAFS website, so I do encourage you to go there. Our section is fairly young. We've only been around since 1972, but we include both physical anthropologists and folks who do archaeology and forensic archaeology. We do have an accreditation process that we go through as PhDs and masters through the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. And you have to have a PhD. I believe, Phoebe, do you know if the master's accreditation is up and running?
I have not heard that it's ready yet, but I have not checked this year.
So
I haven't checked this year.
That's definitely something that's on the books, but right now you have to have a PhD, and then you can go through this accreditation process, and you can become a board-accredited forensic anthropologist and an expert witness. Okay, so what is forensic anthropology? And to be fair, I put this up here. It's not like CSI, and I get a lot of students, mostly at the undergraduate level, who come in and they say, I want to be a forensic anthropologist because I watched Bones or I saw CSI. The definition of forensic anthropology is the application of the science of physical or biological anthropology to the medical legal process. And I put up here, it's not like CSI because we get dirty. Forensic anthropology smells. We deal with dead bodies. There are bugs, there are maggots, there is flesh involved. And you're never going to see a forensic anthropologist that's practicing wearing a clean, pristine white suit or practicing forensic anthropology in heels. So it is a real profession that has real consequences. You work sometimes in a very dirty area, and there are biological health concerns to it. So it's something really serious, not like what you see on TV. Okay, what are some of the major components of forensic anthropology? What are some of the things that you need to know? What are some of the things that you might do? So there are many ways that forensic anthropologists come in contact with human skeletal material. Some of us, like myself and Phoebe, work in the context of universities where we have forensic anthropology labs and where we do active casework, okay? So the core basis of forensic anthropology is the study of human osteology, which is the study of the skeleton or the hard tissues of the skeleton. When an active case comes into a forensic anthropology lab, we will do a series of things depending on what is asked of us. One of the things, sort of the bread and butter, if you will, of forensic anthropology is the biological profile: sex, age, ancestry, and stature. We will also do trauma analysis, pathological or pathology analysis, analysis of anomalies, the postmortem interval, also called the PMI. We tend to get called out to do recoveries. We recover bodies that are in clandestine burials. We recover bodies that are on a surface scatter. And some forensic anthropologists have specific specializations that go beyond some of these things that I mentioned. I, for example, do isotopic analysis. There are other folks who specialize in tool mark analysis. Not everybody has a specialization, but some of us do. In addition to these things on this list, we will practice those specializations on cases as required. So what is osteology? How does it work? And how does it kind of play a role in forensic anthropology? As I mentioned, it's the hard tissue. So that's going to be the teeth and the bone. You are a specialist in the teeth and bone of humans. And you need to be able to discern fragmentary pieces of human teeth and human bones from all other animals that there are. Okay? You need to be able to decide, and you need to be able to identify these. And this is something that forensic anthropologists commonly get asked to do. So instead of a whole case coming in, instead of you going out and doing a whole recovery on a crime scene, the law enforcement officers may come to your lab or may come to your, if you're working in the context of a medical examiner's office, they may come with a single fragment and they may ask you, is this human or not? Okay, so you need to be able to determine from a small piece of bone whether or not what you're dealing with is human. So human, non-human, we've covered that. You also need to know, part of osteology is knowing what is normal and what is not normal. Okay, what is normal and what is pathological. The important thing here is that we don't want to be looking at something that's pathological and diagnosing it as trauma, for example, and then including something that's pathological as trauma in a report. We also want to be cognizant of aging. Bone grows, bone goes through decomposition even when we are alive, okay? And so we need to understand all the phases that human bone goes through, from neonates to juveniles to adults to older individuals, okay? All right, so in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the biological profile. And that, remember, that's the bread and butter of forensic anthropology. And what the steps are when we have a case that would come into a lab. So let's pretend that we have an individual that's unidentified. And so the law enforcement is interested in knowing every single thing that they can about this particular individual. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to confirm that this individual is human, and we're going to confirm how many individuals we have. Okay? What is the minimum number of individuals involved in the bones that we are looking at? Then we're going to go into those 4 components of the biological profile: the ancestry, the sex, the age, and the stature analysis. And the subsequent slides are going to deal with each one of those components. Okay, so this is a real quick, this is a great picture actually. This is touching on human, non-human. So this is a perfect example of something that you might see as a forensic anthropologist as a single sort of example coming into your lab. On the left, we have a bear paw, okay? And on the right, the lighter colored bone, that's a human hand. And you can see the morphological similarity, that is the architectural similarity between these 2 pieces. And if you are not a specialist in human osteology, you may make the mistake of confusing that bear paw for a human hand. And subsequently, the law enforcement is then going to go out and spend quite a bit of money searching for other remains. Okay? So let's go into the biological profile. Okay, so before we kind of start, I want to give you an idea that we have a series of different methods that we use to analyze the biological profile. One of the most important things in forensic science, of which forensic anthropology is a part, is standardization. It is testing the methods that you use. It is understanding the accuracy and the precision of those methods. So in this talk, we're going to talk about general ways, not specific methods that we use, but general ways that we analyze bone. And that's going to be for all of the components of the biological profile. So here you see 3 skulls, okay? And the one on the left, this guy over here, this would be an individual of African American ancestry. This one in the middle here would be an individual of Asian ancestry. And the one to the right would be an individual of European or Caucasian ancestry, okay? And one of the ways that we can analyze ancestral background, which is genetically controlled, is by looking at what we call non-metric, which means we don't measure. We look at the architecture of bone. And I've highlighted 2 of the areas that we use to analyze architecture that is genetically controlled in skulls. And these shapes that I've drawn on here for you kind of give you an idea of what it is that we're looking at. So you can see in the skull on the left, the eye orbit is sort of drawn with a rectangular shape there, whereas the one in the middle has a circular one, and the one all the way to the right has something that looks more like an aviator shape, aviator sunglass shape. Okay? So one way of analyzing ancestry that covers a whole bunch of different types of methods is non-metric, looking at the architecture and looking at the shapes that we see. Another way of analyzing ancestry is by measuring. And we have 3D morphometric analysis, and we have craniometric analysis. And what you see here on the left is a picture of a skull, and these are a pair of calipers, and we are taking a series of measurements. This would be an example of craniometric analysis. Over here to the right, we have a printout. We use programs, several different programs out there on the market. One of them is called Fordisk. Another one that uses 3D morphometrics is called 3DID, and it's actually a free program that you can download, and I have the little website for that here. Fordisk, which is a craniometric program, will give you a printout that looks something like this. And you can see on this little square here, the white square, there's AM and BM, okay? And you can see that AM stands for Asian male. And there's a little star in the quadrant that is assigned to Asian male. So that would be an example of what the printouts will look like. They also have a statistics page that kind of follows out that talks to you about the precision and the accuracy of the measurements that you're taking. Okay, so I want to point out something really quickly before we go on to sex. There is a method in terms of the biological profile, things that we want to do first and things that we want to do second. And I put ancestry as number 1 because a lot of the other methods that we use to determine things like sex and age are ancestry specific. Okay, so we need to know the ancestry of the person that we're dealing with so that we can use the appropriate methods or methodological styles to assess things like sex. So I just want to make sure that you know that the order is planned. Okay, so let's go on to sex and the biological profile. Just like ancestry, we can assess sex using non-metric analysis, which is looking at the architecture. And that is because if we look at the postcranial skeleton, specifically the pelvis, it is highly impacted by birth. And so we see some really significant, statistically significant differences in the architecture of female innominates or pelvis versus males. And this is something that we can analyze, we can track, and so we can look at that morphology. So if you look all the way to the left and you look at the innominate that's on the top, that would be a male innominate. And there's a circle and sort of a little V there. That circle is the pelvic inlet, and in males it's very narrow. And that little V is the subpubic angle, also very narrow in males. The innominate below, that's a female innominate. And you can see that the pelvic inlet is much larger, and the reason for that is because the baby has to be able to pass through there. And so those trends are also followed in some of the pictures that you see above to the right. That's us looking down into the pelvic inlet. F is for female, M is for male. And right here down below to the right, we're looking at two sacra. Sacrums from a female and from a male. And what I'm showing you here is how straight those sacras are in the females versus the males. They're curved. So a curved sacrum is going to block that pelvic inlet, whereas a straight one is not going to block it. It's going to allow the baby to come out. Okay. We can also use the skull or the cranium to assess non-metric sex differences. And it's best to, again, you need to know the ancestry of the individual that you're dealing with, because different ancestral populations are going to be more robust than others. But on the left, we're dealing with a male skull, and all these little arrows are pointing to areas of interest where we know that the architecture is going to be different between males and females in a given population. So obviously on the right, we have a female skull, and just a few of the features that we're looking at. If you find the eye orbit and you kind of go above that, there's a big arrow pointing to this sort of bony eyebrow. This is what we call the supraorbital torus, and it's much more developed in men. If you go down here by the ear and you kind of go behind your ear, that's the mastoid process. Again, much larger generally, and again, these are all in frequencies. So it's not always yes and no, it's not always black and white, but it's a general kind of morphological difference. Males in the same ancestral population tend to be more robust than females, and these are some of the areas where we can see that. Okay, let's move on to aging. And what you're looking at here in this particular slide, you can see that we have individuals on the left, they're at the newborn stage. We go through individuals in childhood all the way to young adults, and then we go into elderly people. Now, I want to make one point. This is one thing I don't like about this slide. You can see that the individual all the way to the right is what we would call edentulous, and that means without teeth, okay? The lack of teeth in a skull does not mean that the person is elderly, okay? So teeth, the presence of teeth does not necessarily mean that an individual is older. And in fact, a lot of times in the context of a forensic anthropology lab, we are going to be seeing people who are, for example, using methamphetamines. And so they're actually very, very young, and they happen to be edentulous. So that's something that you want to be remembering. Instead, what we're going to be doing when we analyze age is we're going to be looking at things like the eruption of teeth. Okay, so when are teeth kind of popping through the gingiva or erupting through the alveolar bone of the mandible and the maxilla? We're going to be looking at things on the skull, like the sutures, which are the lines in between the bones, and when is it that they become closed? We're also going to be looking at the postcranial skeleton, and we're going to be asking things like, when are certain bones forming? When do certain bones become one piece? And as we age, we're going to start looking at degradation. So those are the categories that we're going to look at when we do aging. This is a little picture showing you kind of what I talked about as bones kind of, number one, coming into one piece, fusing together, but also appearing. So if you look at the individual all the way to the left, this little neonate all the way to the left, you can see when you compare that particular individual to the individuals, excuse me, the individual all the way to the right to the individuals all the way to the left, that there's more bones that are present. And if you look at the skull of the individual all the way to the left, you can see that there's actually more fusion that has gone on. So what we look at, especially in kids, number one, is what bones have formed out of the cartilaginous matrix, so what bones are present, and number two, what stage of fusion are those bones in, okay? This is a great photo kind of showing you a young adult femur. So this bone right here that we're looking at on the right, this is the femur, this is the big bone of your thigh, and you can see that in a young adult, it's in several pieces. We've got that big, long, tubular portion in the middle, that's the femoral shaft, and then there are these little end parts, okay, excuse me, and we call these epiphyses. And you can see that these little epiphyses are not connected to that major shaft portion, okay? And that is because it takes time for a bone to fuse into one piece. Now, if you look at the corresponding picture over here with the skeleton, the graph, you'll notice that if you find that big thigh bone and you look at the portion that's the head portion, you can see that the numbers 15 to 17 are written there. And what that is that we know generally that at about 15 to 17 years of age, that head portion, this little ball portion up here, is going to fuse onto the main body of that femur. So if we find somebody who is not fused in that area, we know that they have not reached that age. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we look at aging in young people. Once we become skeletal adults and the skeleton is in one piece, we have to start looking at skeletal degradation. And so what we're looking at here, these are two pictures of the pubic symphysis, okay? So I want you to think about your pelvis, where you put your hands on your hips, that's your pelvis. And in the front, okay, that's where the pelvis comes together, this is the pubic symphysis. What you're looking at on the left, this is a picture of a young person's pubic symphysis. And you can see all these beautiful lines, these ridges and billows. And then if we go over here to the right, to the bone that's a little bit more bleached, you can see that we're looking at the same area, but these are in people that are quite a bit older. And so this is what skeletal degradation looks like. You start to lose that billowy appearance. And that's something that we've assigned phases to and can track. Okay? So we can look at this surface to track that degradation over time. One of the last components of the biological profile that we look at is stature. And there are several ways of analyzing stature. You can measure every single bone in the body and do some corrections for the cartilaginous discs in between. Or you can take a single bone, like our friend the femur, and you can use some discriminant functions from the literature and estimate stature of the person. Okay. I want to go quickly through trauma analysis so we can get to some of the things that I think are really important about education and salary. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if I go too fast at the end. So for trauma analysis, this is something that we commonly testify on in court, less so about the biological profile. And there are kind of two major components to trauma that we testify on and that we analyze. Number one is the timing of trauma. And when I say the timing of trauma, I mean, did the trauma happen before death, at or around the time of death, or after death? So antemortem is before death, perimortem is at or around the time of death, and postmortem is after death. And then we're interested in what kind of trauma are we looking at? Is it blunt force trauma? Is it gunshot trauma, sharp force, etc.? Okay? And to a lesser extent, if you have multiple times of trauma, you may have to answer questions about the timing, the specific timing of multiple injuries on the same person. So what gunshot came first, second, third, etc. Okay. So the key here, what we're looking at is antemortem trauma, trauma that happens before death, well before. And the key that we want to look at here is we're looking for healing. Trauma that happens before death happens in a living person. And when I say before, I mean at least 2 weeks before the time of death. So we need to be able to see some evidence of healing. What does healing look like? If you look at the bone, this sort of beige colored bone all the way to the left, and you see this odd sort of bony scab on it, that is evidence of healing, okay? If you look at the bone at the top and you can see there's clearly a fracture there, but you sort of see this smooth looking bone kind of holding those two pieces together, again, that's evidence of healing. If we go to perimortem fractures, that perimortem timing period, remember that's around the time of death. Now for forensic anthropologists, this is a really difficult period to assess because you're dealing with skeletal material. We're not dealing like medical examiners do or coroners do with soft tissue that goes through a very sequential process of decomposition. So what I mean when I say perimortem is I'm looking at the way that bone is responding to force when it still has the collagen component in it like it does when you are alive. And that perimortem period can be very long. It can extend to several months after you've actually died. The bone will react similarly several months after you've already died. And that's something that we need to kind of explain to juries and to folks when we do this type of analysis. We need to let them understand what that perimortem period is. But essentially what we're looking at is we're going to look at those fractures and we're going to see, are those fractures responding? Is that bone responding like it would have when you were alive? And one of the things we look for is a clean fracture propagation, a clean fracture line. And then the other question is, did the trauma happen after you die? Okay, and so one of the things that we see is that the postmortem period is really the period when bone loses that collagen component, the component that lets it bend. And so what you're looking at here on the right, this is a skull, and you can notice that there's some discoloration between the stained brown skull and then the sort of white area near the fracture. And that's something that we commonly see with postmortem fracturing. If something has happened long after the bone has been in the ground and has lost the collagen component, the fracture will have a different color to the margin, and also the fracture margin under a microscope will look jagged. Okay, here are some examples of the different types of trauma that we may see. Sharp force trauma, okay, and this is going to be anything from machetes, axes, to scalpels. We've got a couple different examples here. Up here is an axe. This up here is an example of attempted dismemberment with a saw. So dismemberment is when you're going to reduce the body into pieces. And this is some neck vertebrae, and there's a little cut mark right there. Blunt force trauma. Now, blunt force trauma can be anything from punches from a hand, a fist, falling down on the ground, getting into an automobile accident, getting into a plane crash. These are all examples of blunt force trauma. And one of the characteristics of blunt force trauma is what you see down here on this photograph at the very bottom, where you have extreme fragmentation. Another thing that we can see with blunt force trauma is tool marks being recorded on the bone. And up here on the left, you've got this little tire iron here, and then you've got a tool mark, and it's a depressed fracture. We see a lot of gunshot trauma as forensic anthropologists. They're all types of guns and the trauma that we can see. Here are a couple of examples. You have all the way to the right on the upper, on the top, you have shotgun injuries. You have some bullets that do not have a full metal jacket on the upper left and in the middle. Okay, this again is a shotgun to the lower left. We will analyze entrance and exit wounds. So over here on the left, you have entrance. So when the bullet goes in, it makes a cookie cutter shape. And as it goes through the skull, you get this internal bevel. And as it blows out the other side, the bullet has deformed, as long as it doesn't have a full metal jacket on it, and will blow bone out. Okay. We commonly see these types of fractures associated with gunshot trauma. That is radiating fractures and concentric, which concentric means C-shape. So you can see on this upper picture here, you've got some radiating fractures and some concentric fractures. Fire trauma is something that we also commonly see, and we see fire trauma commonly in combination with other kinds. So for example, it's not uncommon to get fire trauma and gunshot on the same case. A person does some, they do some gunshot trauma, and then they want to hide it, so they think they can hide it with fire. And that is not true. If you know what you're doing, if you know how to handle burn material, you can certainly see evidence of gunshot trauma. Okay. One of the last things that we may be asked to do is pathological analysis, and so you have to have a knowledge of, remember what we talked about, what is normal and what is not normal. So pathological analysis can be an important component of a case. Up here to the right, you see some dental abscesses, and down here on the bottom to the lower left, this is syphilis, okay? And then to the lower right, this is tuberculosis. Now, the postmortem interval is something that we're working on in forensic anthropology, and this is the time since death. Now, keep in mind, I've mentioned it once before when we were talking about that perimortem period. We're dealing with skeletal material, or material that's highly decomposed, okay, in terms of the soft tissue. So what you see here on this screen are what we call the stages, okay, the stages of decomposition. And there are some methods out there that we're working on standardizing to be able to assess what we think is the time since death based on these decompositional stages, okay? So, for example, the stage fresh, you would have your skin on you, the organs would be intact, you would have very few insects kind of coming to the scene, and those kind of things change. As we go into early decomposition, you're going to see more insects present, the body is going to bloat. As we go into advanced decomposition, we're going to see things like the skin is going to slough off of the body, etc. Okay? And one of the things that we use to help us assess how long the postmortem interval is something called accumulated degree days, and that's why I put this little formula down here, just to make you aware of it. We will do scene recovery, and we will make maps. This is a little cadaver dog in the photo here, and these are some examples of some transect styles that we may walk. And a transect is where you have a bunch of people, usually in a line, and they're arms distance apart, and they will walk a field or a scene looking for evidence. Here are some examples of maps. You can see that we have side view maps. You can see that we have large scene maps. On the right down here, there's a little pair of pants, so you can see it's not just skeletal elements that we're drawing in. We're drawing in everything that's present in the scene. All right, and finally, I mentioned there are some of us who who have specializations, some things that we focus on that we also do in addition to the things that I've mentioned. But I want to make sure that you know we contribute data. So regardless of whether you do DNA as your specialization, the forensic anthropologist does not make a positive identification. The forensic anthropologist provides data with that biological profile, with that trauma assessment that they then give in a report form to a medical examiner, and the medical examiner makes the positive ID. They may use the data that we provide, but we don't make the positive identification, okay? So we're going to see a couple examples of some of those specializations. This is an example of photo superimposition. So we've got a photograph of the individual, the suspected individual, and then we've got a photograph of their skull underneath. And what we're doing there is we're taking tissue measurements to see if this is a possible match. This is an example of radiograph or X-ray analysis, and what we're looking at here, these are the eye orbits right here, eye orbits, and then above the eye orbit, you can see this sort of darkened thing where there's an arrow pointing. That's the frontal sinus. And the frontal sinus has a specific pattern that's unique to each individual, and if you have a photograph that's taken before death and then one of the skull, excuse me, a radiograph after, you can match them up possibly. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I want to make sure that I talk about this quickly. In order to be a forensic anthropologist, you have to have a BA or a BS. So for most of us, that's 4 years. Some of us, it's a little bit longer. There are lots of excellent forensic anthropologists out there practicing with an MA or an MS, and they contribute immensely to the field. So if you want to be an active forensic anthropologist, the minimum educational requirement is an MA or an MS. If you have an MA or an MS, most likely you're going to be a practitioner. So you're not going to be somebody working at the university level like myself. You're going to be a practitioner in a medical examiner's office, or working for a large group like SILHI. And like I say, they produce great work. If you're interested in maybe being a professor, having a university affiliation, you need to have a PhD for that. And a PhD is going to be 4 to 8 years, depending on the individual and depending on where you go, after the bachelor's. Some people have a master's and then go into a PhD program, so that may take additional time. There's sort of an expectation that you're going to have board certification after you are out of the PhD for a while, and if you are seeing active forensic cases. There's also an expectation that you're going to be having membership in some of the professional organizations that are listed here. So AAFS, FACE is the Forensic Anthropology Society of Europe, and IAI is the International Association for Identification. Here are some salary expectations, and you can see that they range, they vary quite a bit depending on what you choose to do. So one thing that I will say is that industry always pays better. So you can see the government forensic anthropologists always tend to make quite a bit more, but they also live in places that are very expensive like Washington, D.C. and Hawaii. Okay. So just to wrap up, this is the checklist that I think that you should consider. And again, I will make sure that that handout that I have for you that goes over all of these things is posted. But you want to make an active CV, something that you keep up on. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate courses. And one of the things that I would say is very important is skeletal biology. That's a really important one. 3 to 4 excellent letters of recommendation. And an excellent letter of recommendation is more than this person did well in my class. An excellent letter of recommendation really talks about who you are as a person and lets your future advisor know, something about you more than they got an A. You got an A in skeletal biology. You want to do a field school. You want to keep that GPA above a 3.5. You want to spend the money on studying for the GRE. It's very, very important. And in the handout, I go into actual numbers that you want to think about. You want to try to get research at the undergraduate level. Apply for scholarships. You're eligible for a National Science Foundation scholarship in your last year of undergrad. You want to think about what it is that you want to research. You want to go on the AAFS website and look at schools. And then you want to ask yourself, what kind of degree do I want to get? Okay, so that's all I have. And thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Chelsey. I think that was a great presentation, covered a lot of important material. So at this time, if you have any questions, feel free to just submit them through that chat box, and we will read them out here and get you some answers. The first one that I do have for you is, what education levels are appropriate to consult on biological profiles and different cases? What would you recommend? Do they need to pursue a PhD, or is a master's sufficient?
I think go ahead, Phoebe. Go ahead.
Oh well, we do have there are forensic anthropologists with a master's degree, and we have an organization within the academy that is mainly filled with people with a master's degree that are practicing forensic anthropology. But I do notice that many of the members will go back to get a PhD. They'll continue on. So from just experience, I would say pursue the PhD. But the real difference is in how much casework you can get as a training graduate student in a master's setting versus a PhD. Because if you aren't exposed to casework, either because the school doesn't get a lot of casework or because the program is too brief, because many master's programs are 2 to 3 years, with more than half of that being classwork, not research, then if you don't get enough experience, you're not going to have enough experience to do your own casework. So part of it is going to depend on the lab that you study in, whether a master's will be enough. And then also it'll depend on where do you see yourself. If you want to be in an academic situation, then you'll need a PhD. If you see yourself in one of the professional situations, like working in a medical examiner's office or for one of the larger crime labs that can afford to have their own forensic anthropologist, then you can do a master's if that lab doesn't prefer PhDs. So, I'd like to say if you have a doubt, get a PhD. But on the other hand, a lot of us have masters.
Yeah, I would just follow up with that really briefly. This is Chelsey. I think that there are some really tremendous forensic anthropologists out there with master's degrees. And I think that if you do want to be a practitioner, that is, that you do want to work in the context of a medical examiner's office, like Phoebe's saying, then I think that a master's degree is perfectly fine. And there are, if you came out of a graduate program that didn't have a very active lab, I agree with Phoebe, that can be a concern. But there are things that you can do to gain experience. So, for example, the Joint POW Accounting Command, or SILHI, the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, which is one of the largest employers of forensic anthropologists in the U.S., they have an internship for master's students. Okay, so you get your master's, and then you can apply to the internship, and there's tons of casework that you would see. And the internships, I think, they vary in length, but there are other places like that you can gain hands-on experience.
The medical examiner's office in Houston, I can't remember which county that is.
Yeah, it's Harris County, with Dr. Jen Love, Harris County. They have an internship as well, yeah.
The Office of the Medical Examiner in New York City, they have a very nice internship program. In Arizona, I don't know if theirs is starting, but I'm not sure if it's the University of Arizona. It's where Brad... Ooh, I'm not good with names. I apologize.
No, I think you're thinking of the Pima County Medical Examiner's
office. Sorry, yeah, Pima County.
Yeah, and it's with Bruce Anderson. Yeah, and they do have a internship program. They have a postdoc program, so for people who are out of their PhDs, and then they have internship programs for master's students. So Phoebe is absolutely right. You need to have experience, because if you are going to be involved in casework, then you're probably going to be testifying in court. And the last thing that you want to do is testify in court if you're not prepared.
Great. So what work would you suggest for someone with just a bachelor's? What does the field look like for them?
Phoebe, do you want to go ahead? I can answer
I would say that employment will be very limited, and it's a risk. I would not seek employment as a forensic anthropologist if I only had a bachelor's degree. The nature of most undergraduate experiences in anthropology in general is 3 to 4 field. And even if you're in a location that has a very busy lab, the undergrads are not the ones that get the first experience. It's the grad students. So unless you happen to have an in, like you have someone you know will hire you with a bachelor's degree, and that would only be in a law enforcement setting or a morgue, then without that in, you don't have the qualifications to pursue work as a forensic anthropologist, not with a bachelor's degree. And you would run an extreme risk of being excluded professionally just because you can't advance in the American Academy with a bachelor's alone, and you can't even join. Technically, I guess you could join as a technician, but you can't maintain that membership with a bachelor's degree. And the testimony, ooh, I would not, as a medical examiner or as a law enforcement agent, I would not want an expert, because I wouldn't consider you an expert if you only had a bachelor's degree. So again, you're not helping yourself if you try to be employed with only a bachelor's degree. Now, if you have a bachelor's in anthropology and it's towards a biological end, and you're thinking, okay, I want to spend some time employed, you know, not going to grad school immediately, you could consider a work in, say, a medical field, because one of the best things I've noticed, just, you know, my many jobs, is to stay familiar with anatomy, stay employed in areas where anatomy is involved, and people with a bachelor's can work as autopsy assistants. And some, I would say you'd be an overqualified autopsy assistant, having been one myself. It's mostly housekeeping with bodies, but I have students that graduated from I don't have a forensic anthropology program, I have a forensic science program. And a couple of my students work as autopsy assistants, but they're not staying at just that job. You know, it's that trend of going on. But right now, they're working as autopsy assistants, and they happen to be in a good setting where they do a lot of cutting. So it's not just housekeeping with bodies for them, but you don't know what the job is until you're in it. So, but it is employment with a bachelor's degree, and so there could be similar jobs, you know, medical related, that only require a bachelor's degree. Even law enforcement, if you don't mind a hierarchically structured employment setting, law enforcement would be good. Science education, I'm talking if you're on the biological end of anthropology, science ed, depending on what state you live in, I would pursue that, because oddly enough, not every state has science educators who are scientists, and biological anthropologists are scientists. So, but I would always be pursuing work with the thought of, if I really wanted to join the forensic anthropology community, I'm going to get a graduate degree at some point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a couple other things that I would suggest depending upon your access to osteology. So for example, one of the things that we do here at NC State is we have a very rigorous osteology course for our undergrads and for our grad students, and it's a fragment-based osteology class. So the students learn osteology and then they are tested on fragments. So that is a skill that you can apply immediately in the context of CRM, cultural resource management. They're always looking for people who have good osteology skills. And if you have, you know, a reputable professor who's a great osteologist and gives you a great class like that, that's something you can definitely do. And I agree with Phoebe. I would say autopsy technicians, but also things like death investigators, these kind of jobs, who are coroner's assistants, and you know, coroners even themselves. If you have a coroner system in the state that you live in, you can go online and you can see that all you need for it to be a coroner is a bachelor's and then some specific classes, and you take the coroner's exam. So
yeah,
these are all things.
Yeah,
these are all things that you can do with a bachelor's degree. But I agree with you, being a forensic anthropologist is not one of them.
Great. Do you have any recommendations to international students who are currently in a master's program but aren't able to get any casework experience due to restrictions in their countries?
Yeah. For international students, the other thing that I would think about is there is a lot of international casework that you can get. So for example, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind are some of the organizations that do a lot of the disaster mortuary response work. Things like Physicians for Human Rights, Kenyan International, DMORT, the kinds of groups that would go to Hurricane Katrina's places where you have to set up a morgue. So there are lots of groups that do this kind of work. In international students, as long as you have osteology, you have really strong osteology, you can apply to these organizations and you can see whether or not you'll be able to get casework in these contexts. They're always looking for people, good qualified people who know the skeleton and who have good training, even if you don't have a lot of casework under your belt. And you can definitely do that with a master's.
And the only other thing I might recommend is you might try some of the internships. I mean, if you can travel, you could try. I have not seen, well, I don't always look at the requirements, but I have noticed that being an American citizen, U.S. citizen is a requirement, but I'm sure it is sometimes for some of them, but it's worth examining if some of the morgue internships would be accessible.
Great. So you mentioned earlier about the ABFA. Is this open to American citizens only, or is it an international organization?
Phoebe, do you want to answer that one, or I can start?
Yeah, I was trying to think. I think it's international, technically.
I believe so too. I'm not 100% sure on that, but you also have to remember that the other organization that I mentioned to you, the FA's organization, Forensic Anthropology Society of Europe, they are actually doing an accreditation now too. They're starting it this year. That's a new thing. So if you are, Latin America, Europe, you can go through FA's and you can get an accreditation. So they are going to be, I think, really kind of taking up the international accreditations. I don't know that you would be stopped from doing ABFA, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up.
Well, would you, so for students, is there an organization that you recommend that they seek out early on in their career and become active in?
Yes, I recommend that. So first of all, I recommend that all students who are interested in forensic anthropology attend the AAFS meetings, the annual meetings. And it can be pricey if you're an undergrad. It can be. But AAFS is really supportive of both undergraduate students and master's students. And as I mentioned, we have several things kind of going on. We have the Young Forensic Scientist Forum. If you are a first-time attendee, you'll get a special tag on the meeting that lets everybody know that it's your first time coming to the meetings. And if you wear that, people in your field, in your discipline, will go out of their way to kind of introduce themselves to you. And so that might be a way for you to meet some of the people that you might be interested in working with. So I definitely recommend AFS for sure. There are also a couple regional, smaller meetings that might be easier for students who are sort of financially strapped to attend. There is one that was just recently held in Ohio called BARFA. There is the MD&Cs, which is held in Arizona. Used to be held at Lake Mead, but they've changed the location. But there are several of these little kind of small, very relaxed regional meetings that you can go to as a student. Again, you're going to meet regional anthropologists from your area. You're going to maybe get to know people in a more relaxed way, and that might be preferential for you instead of going to something big like AFS right away.
Great. So as a bachelor's, studying physical anthropology, would you recommend a minor in biology or chemistry, or would you talk a little bit about the hard sciences and how that integrates?
Phoebe, you want to start on that one?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking up the diplomates. What could you ask the question again?
Oh, I can answer. No problem.
Oh, okay.
So, go ahead. If you want to, go ahead. It's fine.
No, I don't know. I lost the question. What was the question?
The question is, could you talk a little bit about the hard sciences in relation to forensic anthropology? Would you recommend someone with a bachelor's pursue biology or chemistry?
Both. I would recommend, if you had to say you thought, oh, I'm an anthrop major, I'm going to double major with biology, especially pre-med or a molecular biology track, one of those two. You don't have to, but you would have to at least say, I'm going to add biology, a year of biology, a year of chemistry, a year of calculus, and if you're capable, put in a year of physics. I don't even care which physics, as long as you put in one, and some kind of stats, and as many, you know, if you could take like because stats courses are recipe courses, so if you could take like sociological stats or psych stats, and then the stats course that's upper division in your biology department, if you could take that one too, it would just help. It would be great, actually. But biology, at least a year. And then the nice thing about not double majoring is you can just explore the upper division biology courses and take the ones that might have more appeal. Like you could take genetics and um, then a molecular techniques course if you have access to it, or you could take biochemistry, which it could help you, but it's not necessary. I'm talking about just growing your skeletal interest, and if you go, oh, I'm interested in skeletal biology, then as far as skeletal development, you know, on a cellular level, then you may wish you'd taken biochemistry uh, when you're an undergrad. But if you don't go that, you know, if you don't ever develop that interest, you won't miss it. But I can say from my own perspective, I came from an anthropology program that required bio and chem and calculus, but it didn't require, well, maybe there wasn't genetics. I'm not that old, but there might not have been that class. It didn't require it, and I wish still that I had taken it. I mean, I had the amount that's in a year of biology, but I did not take the whole course. I took a molecular techniques course later as a PhD student, but I almost missed the boat on that. And they're just some related fields that if you might develop an interest in the skeletal application of that field, you won't have access to it unless you took the science behind it. So like the isotopes people, well, if you've had no chemistry, you will have no grasp of what they're talking about, even enough to go, oh, that makes sense. You know, that's science that I could get behind. Same for DNA. You know, it's exciting, but if you never had any biology, you know, it's meaningless. And physics would have been more physics. That's another one of my, I wish mine had required physics, because it didn't, so I didn't take it. And now I look back and I go, oh, some forms of trauma analysis, it'd be nice to have a little more physics. But you take as many of the freshman level courses of the natural and physical sciences, take all of them if you can, and the year of calculus.
Yeah,
You may go calculus as a weed out, but it's helpful.
I agree with Phoebe, and one of the things that I would say to follow that up is that, you know, we're going through a process right now in forensic anthropology, in terms of forensic anthropology graduate programs at the master's and at the PhD level, where we're changing what we require students to have. So right now, across the board, you're not going to find, you know, like for example, when you go to medical school, they all have those requirements like Phoebe was talking about. But that's going to start happening too in forensic anthropology programs. They're going to start listing, you must have a year of stats, you must have a year of bio, you must have. So it can only help you, even if you kind of get in the window before that actually happens. It can only help you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Do you guys know anything about degrees from other countries and how they affect your work here in America? Are they still recognized on pretty much the same level, or yeah?
They do get recognized, yeah, because you know there's a school and a Tall Simmons program. Her students progress on, and I think they're only a Master's of Science level. So if they go on to the PhD, the degrees translate to other universities. So it's not it's the same problem as if you're transferring from an international school to a U.S. school. You have to do the course by course negotiation or the degree by degree negotiation to have your degree recognized at that next institution. So if an employer wants to ask that question, they can, but some degrees they're so equivalent. You know, if you see a master's and a transcript that shows you science coursework, you're going to go, yeah, it's a master's of science. I agree. But it's the employers, each individual employer gets to decide that. It's not a universal policy.
I agree with that. And the other thing that I would say is that I highly encourage any international students that wish to end up working or in a PhD program in the US to invest in coming to the AAFS meetings, because FaceTime with people that you want to work with, or having an advisor that's really active in AAFS who can introduce you to people that you want to work with is something that it is really going to help you. It's
And
hard
you'll
to
need, oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, you'll need, especially for international applicants, to become an associate member of the academy in our section, you need to have 2 letters of reference from people who are members or fellows in the section. And I have noticed that international applicants really have a hard time mustering 2 references, and the reference has to know you. So it's not enough to say, oh, I emailed them and asked them to supply a letter, and then they supplied one. Well, you still lack 1 because you need 2. And on top of that, the reference supplied indicates that they didn't know you, that they only, so we do have to speak to that in the letter of reference. So attendance at the meetings, I agree wholeheartedly, Chelsey. Attendance at the meetings is critical if you do not have locally attached to you a member of the academy in the physical anthropology section. But there's still also the problem is you need 2. And I've seen applicants who they had 1. They had 1 that knew them very well, but it was only 1. And in the course of attending, the applicant had attended the academy meetings, but they hadn't spent enough time making connections to other members of the academy, and that can be difficult. I recognize that, but
yeah, and then that's going to impact your ability to gain employment, to get into a PhD program, to progress in the professional spheres that we have here. And it's a fact. So it's something that you really need to take into consideration if you're international, or if you're an American student who goes to a school internationally. You have to take into consideration that if you want to be employed here, you need to be keeping your foot here, 1 foot here in the U.S. and attending those meetings and really keeping relationships up with people who are here.
Great, I think that's great advice. So how would you classify the job market for forensic anthropologists right now? Are they in high demand, or do you feel like yeah?
I have not seen any I haven't seen any postings for academic positions. Have you seen any, Chelsey?
I have. I've seen. There's been a few recently,
Oh.
and they are available pretty regularly. There are academic postings available pretty regularly. The problem is that forensic anthropology has become really popular, and so there are many applicants for every job. So that's the kind of crux, and I think that's the way it is in all of academia. We're better off than some people. So for example, I have a lot of friends from grad school who are astrophysicists, and they have a really bad job market. So our job market is a little bit better than theirs, but our job market is definitely worse than other things, like maybe, for example, nursing. Yeah, I would say that it's a little bit more difficult. So that's definitely something you need to take into consideration, because getting a job is how good you are, but also who you know. And so those 2 things combined are what get you the job that you get.
Yeah, there is that element. I do notice. I mean, when I get that question, I do tell people that the people I saw come in as grad students, they're around and they do get employed. So I find that there's a strong element of those who want to stay in, stay in. So they manage employment. So I would say if part of that managing, to stay involved in the community, part of that's obviously making connections and seeking any related forensic job, if that is what it took to stay employed until the job came along.
Okay.
And I think definitely one part of that is also publishing. You've got to publish. It's very important.
And another related question is, what's the average age of people you see going into the field nowadays?
Well, people who are employed or people who are grads? Because employed, the entry level is still like, early 30s. When do we finish a PhD? Mid 30s? Early 30s.
Early 30s, I think. Late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're subject to that same population issue of, their baby boomers getting ready to retire. If it's an academic position, whether or not there'll be a new hire is dependent on things like state funding and if that institution is hiring, or if they maintain having a forensic anthropologist. The morgue positions, that's often caseload driven, and so large population areas, sometimes they need 3 or 4 forensic anthropologists. So the market can vary. It depends what you want to be as a forensic anthropologist.
Great. Are there any online bachelor's programs that you recommend, or?
Online. Well, we're practical though, so even if it were online, it would have to be, part online and part face to face. So I don't know of any.
I don't either, and I would agree with Phoebe. I think it's great to have a university that either offers distance education courses, or to be kind of in the know and know where there's great distance education courses that you can take. So, for example, if you're at North Carolina State and you know that University of Utah offers this great GIS course, then I support that. But I think that if you're going to get a quality education in the fundamentals that are going to help you to be a forensic anthropologist, these are going to be things like anatomy. These are going to be things like osteology, and they, in my opinion, are done best hands-on.
I agree wholeheartedly with Chelsey, because sometimes, I know from teaching osteology and watching undergrads take osteology that the ones that won't touch the bones, and don't ask me why they took an osteology class and they won't touch the bones, but the ones that will not spend time touching the bones, they get the lowest grade in the long run. It's like there's some other level of familiarity that comes from learning the old way. You pick up the bone, touch it, feel the weight of it, feel how it varies, feel the texture of a femur versus a humerus. And they aren't the same. The structure makes the texture different. But if you don't touch it, you don't know it. And they don't touch it. So how would you learn that online? You have to be face to face.
Great. Well, I think I've gotten through all the questions that have been submitted so far. If you guys would like to say anything in closing, I think now would be the time, and that would give the audience just a moment to collect their thoughts and ask any last questions they have.
I had, Chelsey, can you click back to that checklist?
Sure.
It's not just because I want to steal it, but because there was something on it that reminded me of
I will, like I said, I have the checklist is part of a larger handout that I have that I will make sure is posted for everybody. And let's see, no, it's right here. Yeah. And it's a whole handout that I have, and this is just one portion of that handout, and it goes in detail for each one of the things that are on the checklist. Talks about what they mean, gives you some examples, like, for example, there's an appropriate course list.
That's good. The GRE scores, I want to second Chelsey on that. Take whatever means necessary to get the highest GRE score you can. So if you say you're a bachelor student and you decide I'm going to go to one of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting before you graduate, I recommend that even for the professional degrees. But one of the things you'll see if you go is that there are a lot of young women applying or planning or entering forensic anthropology, young women. And those young women are very similar. They're female, and they're mostly white. And if you're a mostly white female, how do you differentiate yourself from all the other mostly white females? You can't turn male, but you can have a very nice GRE score. And of the students I've worked with who have gone on to grad school, okay, that was 2. Okay, it was actually 1.5. But the half has such excellent GRE scores, that's all I heard about. Everyone, my colleagues who were trying to get her into their program, oh, you're a student with the GRE scores. I heard that 5 times from 5 different programs. And all this while, I thought, well, it's a letter of recommendation and, adequate coursework with not, good GPA with science classes, not just anthropology classes, and they had a good, yeah, just more letter of reference in mind. They went to field school. Maybe they did some independent study projects, maybe not. But no, it was a GRE score I heard about. No one mentioned, well, okay, one person mentioned the letter of reference too. So,
yeah, it's very, very important. And on, like I say, on the handout, I actually go into the numbers. Now, I'm sure you're aware that the GRE system has changed and they have a new scoring system, but a lot of schools will still use the old number system. So they will translate whatever your new score is, that new scoring system, into an old scoring system. And some schools, if you go on their website, they will actually tell you, you have to have this number on the GRE or you're not going to be considered. So spend the money on yourself, take a class, invest in your future, because that number not only gets you into grad school, it also makes you eligible or a better candidate for the big grants that are going to pay for your education and prevent you from going into debt. So
yes.
it's a really, really important thing that you need to think about.
Yes, because you do want to balance the debt load with when your prospective job. Because you know, I didn't borrow money until my PhD, and I still have over $50,000 of student loan debt. I think it was well worth it because I'm paying my bills. But you have to consider: do you want to have over 50,000? Okay, I had considerably more than that, but do you want to have that? Because if that will weigh on you, you know, personally, if that kind of load weighs on you, then it's not good to go into debt. But if you go into debt thinking, yeah, I'll have a job, I'll pay it, then you're good.
So I really encourage everybody to look at the handout and to use the checklist. It's tried and true. It's something that I've been you know, developing over a long period of time and have given to many, many students. And I think one of the most important things that you can do for yourself in terms of forensic anthropology is, if this is something that has really captured your, you know, your focus, if it's something that you love to do, then it can be a good life. I love my life. I love my job. I wake up every day very happy to do my job. And you can have that same kind of life, just you need to be focused and you need to be organized. And so if you are focused and organized and you can, you know, you can look at each one of these categories and think about them as ways to modulate yourself as the best possible candidate that you can be. You know, you know, really push that GPA, really push those scores, really do the research, modulate each one of these categories, and then when it comes time to apply, you'll have a really great looking overall package, and then you'll be choosing from different schools that are saying yes to you, as opposed to worrying about whether or not you're going to be able to get in. So.
Great. Well, I do have a couple more questions here. So is there anything that you would suggest for someone with a master's already who doesn't really want to teach at the university level? So a PhD doesn't make sense, but is having trouble finding a job in the field.
So are they also saying no to community college teaching too? Because you can teach at a community college with a master's.
Yeah, but they don't want to teach. I don't think they're going to want to get into that whole academic venue. I would say try one of the morgues. You know, the big city morgues, New York. Well, they already have one at Fort Worth, Houston, L.A. But no. Well, you could try a morgue or yeah, try a morgue. They may hire you. You may have to start as an autopsy assistant or as a death investigator. But it's a route. It is hard to avoid the academic angle, but oddly enough, about 40% of us we work in morgues or labs. So there's the Army, you know, JPAC, and the Joint POW Accounting Command. They hire people with masters.
I highly recommend going onto the AAFS website and looking at the posted jobs that are there, because they will post jobs for things like coroners. They will post jobs for things like death investigators, for forensic technicians, and it can kind of give you an idea of where those kinds of jobs might be. And the other thing is, it might give you an idea of some additional qualifications that you might need. So a lot of times for folks who work in the context of a medical examiner's office, they're not always looking, especially if they're smaller, they're not always looking for somebody who's just a forensic anthropologist. They may be looking for somebody who can process trace evidence. They may be looking for somebody who can also do crime scene photography. So if you know that you don't want to teach, you already have a master's degree, look around and see if any of those jobs kind of spark your interest, and then what kind of extra things you might need to have, tools under your tool belt to be really competitive for a job like that.
Yeah, if the location is a problem, like if you're determined to live in a certain place, then you will be limiting your access to other jobs. Especially death investigators in some areas, in this city by city, parts of states, the death investigator is always a retired law enforcement person. In other places, like parts of Florida, it's not. It's a variety of personnel, retired law enforcement, people with master's degrees. So it depends. You have to look around. I would say be willing to move, no matter what. If you can move, change location, then you could try the death investigation route and see if that will work towards death investigation with skeletal material in it. At the very least, you might end up as being, well, when you finally got that skeletal case, you knew what to do, as opposed to having to find a forensic anthropologist elsewhere. But yeah, it's harder if you don't want to teach.
Great. Well, hopefully that can get some brainstorm going.
Yeah, I would say one other thing I would suggest, depending on what how much, if you in the course of your education got 20 hours of chemistry, look at entry-level forensics. We say forensic scientist 1 or criminalist 1 positions, because someone with 20 hours of chemistry will qualify for those, and it's not unreasonable or atypical to get 20 hours while chasing around the hard sciences as an undergrad. If you have molecular techniques, like if by some chance you got genetics, molecular techniques, biochemistry, a stats course, and population biology. If you went the biology route while getting your degrees, then definitely apply for an entry-level crime lab job, because then you could be a DNA analyst. You wouldn't be the senior level one, but you'd be entry level. So it just depends on what other courses you have. If you don't have all of those, but you have some of them, and you're just you're in the middle of employment or things to do, take the ones that are missing, and then apply. That would be an affordable, I think, stopgap.
Great. And the last one I got for the night is it possible for someone to recover from a low GPA at an undergraduate level, even with a 3.5 at the master's level, when applying to a PhD program? What would you recommend to help them? Is that really a problem? Yeah.
Phoebe, would you like to start on that one?
Yes, you can recover, but I hope the recovery includes a very high GRE score and then excellent letters of reference. It may depend on, the idea of recovery. It may depend on who where are you applying. So say you got a 3.5 as a master's student, but then you're turning around to apply to Florida or Tennessee. Those programs get a lot of applicants, and I would not expect to get into one of those programs unless my letter writers somehow had influence with the faculty at those schools. Because that's the only other thing you have when all the other applicants have 4.0s as undergrads and perhaps higher GRE scores. If you have added on to your, this portfolio, the time spent at the meetings already, time spent while you were a master's student, you spent time meeting meeting the faculty at the schools where you want to attend, and not just meeting them, but through your presentations or through your questions, demonstrating that you do have a solid background, that you are able to manipulate the information in our field. You might be able to build a connection that you can further on into, okay, I'm going to go to grad school at that program. But there are other programs that, now there are more programs that will support a PhD, but I think Chico has one now in California. Or, I mean, now they have.
I think Chico is still a master's program.
Is it still a master's?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's still a master's program.
Ah.
Yeah.
Santa Cruz is out. They take like one student every 3 years or 4 years or 5. But okay, so there are not a lot of PhD programs, and okay, but no, this depends on your situation. There's one other thing. If you went to a master's program that had a lot of casework, you could just go to a PhD program in physical anthropology. You know, be a human osteologist. I mean, that's what we are. Be a human osteologist in training at a very nice, lots of skeletal material, even if it's archaeological, human osteology program. That's a perfectly reasonable route, because if you look in the backgrounds of many of our members, we were first human osteologists in some way, shape, or form, and then law enforcement came knocking. So you could try that route. You go, oh, well, I didn't have a lot of casework. If you're still in school, or even if you're not, consider applying to one of the internships. I'm always thinking JPAC, because they do a lot of casework, and it's of a quality where I would like to, I think that would be a good experience if you're seeking casework. You would have to have some skeletal knowledge already, though. So I'm assuming that the master's program included a skeletal background. So you get some casework at an established internship where you're making connections with forensic anthropologists that can vouch for your mental skills, literally, and the casework itself is supporting your background as a forensic anthropologist as one operating, and then you use the social connections to say, basically to say, make an exception if you're applying to something like a Florida or a Tennessee. Make an exception when you have all these high GRE people already published. But I would go Chelsey's route too and say, if you can, be published before you start applying, because having a journal article, even if it's starting with a technical note, those are good. Case reports, well, they still have that analytical bent that has to be met, and then sometimes state by state you can't always publish case reports, but something peer reviewed, that is a good way to show. But even having poster presentations and podium presentations, they get peer reviewed to some degree, so that's also a good way to say, no, I'm serious, I'm real, and I'm actually functional and capable of being a forensic anthropologist. And that's the only backdoor route in, when there aren't these other stellar qualities that on paper. I mean, the stellar qualities on paper, because if they don't know the human being already, and they're just going with a paper file, then there have to be all these standout features on the paper. But if they know you as a human being, conference attendance, publications, internships, experience like that, then they can ignore the lack of shining stars on the paper.
Yeah, the last thing I would add to that, and Phoebe touched a little bit on it too, is that, and this kind of, if you look at the checklist, I really emphasize excellent letters of recommendation. So, this really highlights it. Do I think you can recover from a low GPA in undergrad? Yeah, for sure. And you already have a master's? Yes, for sure. But an excellent letter of recommendation, in my opinion, okay, on the scale of excellent letters of recommendation, means that whoever your letter recommender is, if needed, they would call that person at that school on your behalf to say, you need to take this person. Maybe, maybe this person had a low GPA when they were in undergrad, but they are serious and they are committed and they are good. So all of these criteria on the checklist, you need to be really serious about each one of them. But the one you need to think about the ones that are in your control as you progress through your education. So if your GPA is no longer in your control, if your GRE score is no longer in your control, what is in your control? And if the letters of recommendation are in your control, then you need to put the time in to make relationships with people so that if needed, to distinguish you from other students, you could get a letter that was so good that that person could really talk about your quality. And of course, obviously the publication.
Yeah, Chelsey's 100% correct, 100%. And if you're fortunate to where you can find out that your letter writers, one or two of them, know the anthropologist at the school where you want to study, take advantage of that. Find letter writers like that. Because we do actually, I mean, I say that not having a grad program, but I was one of those students who had letter writers that knew the person I wanted to study with. I had two out of my three letter writers. And I found out later that the man I wanted to study with, William Maples, he called them because he wanted to know if I was crazy or not, or serious, because, you know, our field attracts crazy people. So sometimes you get it does.
Personal company excluded, right?
Right, of course. You are not crazy. I don't know about myself, but still, no. And so we call them. We do. And it's true. We do call.
Yeah, we do call.
This
Yeah.
is a long grad school. It's hard work. It's serious, and our field, like Chelsey was saying at the beginning, we sometimes see horrible things. I mean, horror can vary. I must admit, the things that I don't find a very rotten corpse that horrible, but some people, yeah, it's traumatizing. I've worked beside grad students that had to leave the room and cry because of things they saw in what I considered to be a relatively more sterile environment of the morgue. And so recognizing that, letter writers, people that have worked with you beyond assigning a grade to you in a class, letter writers can vouch that you're able to take it and pursue a grad degree, all of the rigors of a grad degree, and succeed. But Chelsey's right.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much for presenting this evening. I think there's a lot to be gained here, and you guys said it all very well. And thank you to the audience for participating this evening and sending in so many great questions and being here. If you know someone who would be interested in this presentation or want a copy of the handout, all that information will be available online at AAFS's .org, the website. If you go under resources and then AAFS videos, you'll find a link to all of the past webinars, including this one, as well as the PowerPoint presentations, and Chelsey's handout will be there too. So thank you so much for being here, Phoebe. Thank you so much, Chelsey. It was great.
Thank you.
And thanks you for moderating too.
It's my pleasure.
That was great.